This is the Infotagion podcast, the vaccine to the disinformation virus. In 1940, the fake Lord Haw-Haw's Germany Calling broadcasts from Bremen reached a regular audience of 6 million people in the UK, and 3 times that number were occasional listeners. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union's Operation Infection sought to persuade people in Western Europe that the AIDS virus had been created by the United States government and was being spread by their agents. State-backed disinformation is not new, but it's still a weapon today. In this special edition of the podcast, we're going behind the scenes at NATO to find out how the alliance tackles modern information warfare. I'm Damian Collins, and today I'm joined by Baiba Braje, now the Assistant General Secretary of NATO for Public Diplomacy, having previously served as the Latvian ambassador in London. We'll also be hearing from Burcu, the Director of Operations in NATO's Operations Division. Baiba Braje, it's fantastic to have you on the podcast. I, like many other people in London, sort of know you well from your time with us as ambassador to Latvia, and we were very sorry to see you move this summer to NATO. But you have a fantastic and fascinating new role as Assistant General Secretary for Public Diplomacy. I thought perhaps by way of introduction, you might be able to tell listeners to the podcast a little bit about NATO's work in public diplomacy and your role as Assistant General Secretary.
Thank you very much, and good to hear your voice. I hope that the pandemic is over soon and we can meet in person again. So what NATO does, of course, are 3 basic things. One is the defense and deterrence of its population. Second is managing crisis. And third is ensuring that there is cooperative security, meaning working with partners all across the globe. And my task as ASG for public diplomacy is to ensure that our strategic communications across the board, be it within the NATO headquarters with commands, strategic commands, are aligned and in support of NATO's policies. So that is, in short, what we do.
And I mean, disinformation, which we're very aware of now in the social media context, has always been, a factor in NATO's work, because in the days of the Soviet Union, the Soviets were actively engaged in spreading disinformation. Indeed, one issue we've spoken about on the previous podcast was, I think it was called Operation Infection, which is the disinformation around how the HIV virus was created, suggesting that it had been created in an American laboratory. I mean, is a lot of NATO's work focused on disinformation from Russia or China or other countries, or does it look at disinformation networks within the NATO members as part of its work in public diplomacy?
I think we have to remember that subversive actions by our potential adversaries have been around for a long time. So there is a change in methods, there's a change in approaches, but the ultimate aims have not changed so much. So currently what we have seen during the pandemic is quite a peak in various hostile information activities, in misinformation, disinformation, and open propaganda. And it has come from a variety of sources. It has come from state sources, it has come from state supported and owned media of potential adversaries, and it has come also from other actors that are sort of enabled by potential adversaries to NATO. And what we have identified are several trends. One is to portray NATO as weak, split, unable to defend, unable to help its populations. So on that account, we have been very clear that as soon as we saw that there is a message like that is coming out, we came out with facts straight away. So, for example, on pandemic help, there are several hundred flights that NATO has done to help its own populations. Military has helped civilian hospitals. Military has supplied civilian medics with all types of equipment. Allies have helped allies. So we have done very factual debunking of this misinformation and disinformation in that respect. Then, of course, there is a wider field of conspiracy theories that endanger health and endanger security of societies and human security as such. So there we work very closely with other international actors, such as the EU, that has also faced quite a large amount of disinformation and propaganda attacks, and with the UN, which has launched a so-called verified campaign, meaning that you trust verified sources and share only information that is verified. So this, in short, is our approach. So responding with facts, being proactive about what we do ourselves, and working with other actors to defend, our societies and global interests.
Yes, when last summer when we were both in Riga for the conference organised by the NATO Strategic Communication Centre, one of the things
those were the times, Damian.
I know those were the times. I know we could travel and so on. One of the things I was interested in hearing some of the participants talking about was disinformation in the military context, because in some ways we're sort of most familiar with it, thinking about it being directed towards civilians through social media. But I was very interested in some gaming that NATO had done, looking at how disinformation could be used to try and interfere with troop movements and positioning and military exercises. And is that something that NATO particularly focuses on, or is that treated differently?
Yes, of course we do, because again, our task as a military and political alliance is to ensure both the defense and deterrence, of our territories, but also to make sure that our military enjoys wide civilian support and is able to function. So both when we look at the operations, when we look at NATO's missions, there was very clear task to ensure continuity of our core tasks. So that is where we concentrated. There was disinformation particularly targeted at our military forces, and I will ask Burcu to tell a little bit more about it. She's the director of operations at NATO.
So there have been a number of fake or fabricated news that specifically targeted our deployments, our exercises. This false letter by the Secretary General regarding the enhanced forward presence in Lithuania is a prime example. There were also fake interviews, fabricated letters, other issues, and recently we have seen Baltops, the major naval exercise, and also Allied Spirit, which is connected with Defender Europe, also being targeted. So these are ongoing. You have mentioned, Damian, that this is nothing new. Also in the Cold War, these were happening, and we have also seen these happening before COVID. But seems to be that COVID has provided pretext for certain actors to go out with such disinformation campaigns. And as Baiba mentioned, we have already been actively training and exercising to respond to disinformation in operations. Our troops are more familiar with these types of attacks as a result. They are better prepared to identify them as well as to respond to them. And we are also actively learning the lessons that currently of these attacks, ongoing attacks, and we will continue to incorporate them in our training and exercises in the future as well.
And I would especially like to commend the UK in this respect, which has been one of the most reliable partners in terms of, sharing their experience on strategic communications, on capability building, on information sharing, and all other things. And your MOD and military has been exceptionally good in that respect.
That's what's very good to hear. I was going to ask, actually, is there good sharing of intelligence and information between the different NATO members and NATO? And indeed, do you also work closely with bodies like the European External Action Service in the EU?
Yes, we work very closely. There's both institutional and also, people-to-people cooperation on both on information sharing, on the rapid alert system, which enables us not only with the EU, but also with the wider network of G7 communicators to understand what is happening in the information environment and how to respond to that. But also, obviously, we want to be very proactive about what our approach is and what we do. And this is where integrated communications come into play. So we work with the allies in supporting their activities. We do our own comms as NATO. And then, of course, we work with the international partners, and that is across the board, both civilian and military side of things.
One of the things that people sometimes say to me is about disinformation is, well, do people really believe it? Is it really effective? But but the fact that NATO takes such a strong interest in it, to me, would suggest that there are real world consequences of disinformation, and unchecked, it can have severe consequences. And how serious a threat do you consider this sort of disinformation, be it directed at military targets or at the civil population?
I think we have to be quite clear about the terminology, disinformation, which is a specifically targeted, activity, or misinformation, which might be shared, which is not a precise information or information that is not correct, but without a sort of specific negative intention. And what we see with disinformation, yes, as Burcu has said, it has been targeted against the military, in particular, against the particular exercises. It has not really affected NATO because we were, again, quite agile and able to find out what is happening and where the truth is. So allies have been great in that respect. For the wider, portrayal of NATO within the member states as, suddenly crumbling and unable to perform, we asked both the allies and very quickly provided the factual information that was there, that not only allies were able to help allies, and NATO was playing a role in ensuring that the supplies get to where they have to get, but we were also able to help partners, so countries outside NATO. So in that respect, both the actions and substance mattered, the fact that we were able to communicate very quickly. Then on misinformation, Damian, as you know, the conspiracy theories that abound currently is a quite serious issue. So, and there we also ask civil society groups, trusted media groups, politicians, reliable other sources to come in and play their role, because that is a whole society effort, really.
Absolutely. I mean, thinking of particular countries, Ukraine is often cited as being the sort of on the front line of the disinformation war, and is that NATO's experience as well?
And again, Burcu can tell a little bit more, but the way we work with Ukraine is both to support them in the efforts that they do, especially on fighting disinformation and fighting propaganda, but also support them on capability building of their society as such, both in democratic institutions, on military, on the accountability of military to civilian leadership. So it's all across the board, the real fighting capabilities, but also the ability to debunk and to be proactive in their own information and strategic communications.
It did indeed seem, Damian, like Ukraine was the test bed for a certain use of hybrid tools, coordinated use of different tools, from disinformation up to the military tools. And we have a close cooperation with Ukraine on how to counter hybrid warfare or hybrid campaigns. And we share information, share experience, best practices with Ukraine, and also with several other partner nations, because this is quite a widespread phenomenon now. It may have started or may have sort of gained prominence in Ukraine, but it is also used more widely.
One issue I think that as a consequence of pandemic we will be faced with, and as democratic countries we have to all think what to do about it, is the media landscapes that will be changing. We see that quite a number of media organizations have been affected, that their profits are falling, that there is a difficulty to sustain the independent journalism. So if we think about it as the institution that is valuable for democratic societies, and we don't want everything just to be shared in groups on social media, that will be something that we have to think as an enabler of functioning of democratic countries.
I think that's a really important point, because I think we've seen the double effect of the power of social media as the place many people go to get their news from, and the decline of independent journalism to inform society as well. And we could end up in a bad place if people ended up being reliant on a swirl of news and information on social media, much of which, rather than being prepared by experts and edited and with verifiable sources, is just something that is unchecked and potentially very misleading. And I think that is a big concern. I mean, has NATO developed relationships with the social media companies to try and share intelligence about disinformation networks and potential harm that is being caused by them?
As you will appreciate, I'm unable to answer that question very directly, but in terms of work with various partners, be it in the private or state sector, there is a close collaboration, and our concerns are shared both with the EU, that is doing quite a lot of work currently on as you know, code of practice for against disinformation for social media platforms and tech companies, and also in a dialogue with a number of companies themselves.
Yeah, and I mean, one trend that people have talked about relating to coronavirus is that they've seen networks the pre-existing networks of disinformation that have started talking about coronavirus. So that there's not necessarily new groups or new networks being set up that may be spreading disinformation about coronavirus, but networks that were previously talking about other subjects. And again, I'd be interested to know whether that is from NATO's work, something you've noticed as well.
Yes, we have seen it in the reports and investigations by a number of experts and reliable sources, let's put it that way. And we have seen in our information environment analysis that, again, from certain state sources, there have been also a spike of activity during the pandemic. That basically pandemic used as a reason for achieving other aims.
Before we sort of bring our discussion to a close, I just wanted to just to go back and ask Baiba and Burcu about the use of technology. I mean, NATO is a great, if you like, sponsor and advocate for the use of new technological solutions. I saw you recently presented your innovation award for companies tackling disinformation. I mean, are you able to tell us a little bit about sort of what NATO does in promoting new technologies and innovative techniques to help combat disinformation?
Obviously, with the rise of the data and artificial intelligence, quite a number of things are changing, especially in the information environment understanding. So that is one sector that we are investing in, both in terms of create our own awareness and agility to respond, but also to basically understand from machine learning, what types of developments we will have in the near future. So that is one area. The other area is obviously military capabilities for our troops and for our military. What will be needed in the future. And that is one of the strongest work trends that we are looking at currently. And that concerns both the, for example, unmanned submarine vehicles, where you can have quite an agile fleet of vehicles in, shallow waters to understand what is happening, but also to communicate if necessary on what they will see. We invest in big unmanned aerial drones. From one hand, obviously, that is to make our understanding for military purposes better on what is happening. But from other hand, it's also to show that NATO has these capabilities and that we are ahead in terms of technology. So when we think about NATO 2030 and to make it stronger militarily, stronger politically, and with a more global approach, as the Secretary General has said, we will need these capabilities, these most modern technological capabilities in all three sectors. And that will be, again, both through the cooperation with the private sector, with the partners outside NATO, and enabled, obviously, by very strong communications, integrate communications by NATO itself to make sure that our populations and also potential adversaries understand what we are doing. We are not doing it just for our own fun. We are doing it to make sure that our populations can sleep soundly. So I always say NATO is in the business, is competing with pharmacies. We let our societies sleep soundly.
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting as well, because some people say that, well, social media is so big, there are so many billions of users, so much content being posted all the time. How can you possibly keep track of what's being said? How can you find the bad stuff? But it would seem that there are technologies now which make it much easier to try and identify content that is potentially harmful.
Yes, absolutely. And again, going back to our democracies, it's very, very important to have those trusted sources that are in our societies, that are trusted communicators, that are be it independent journalists or civil society organizations. And again, at NATO, we communicate with facts. We tell true facts, and we communicate through our actions, obviously.
I can also add to this in that same line that NATO really is supporting transparency and is walking the talk in terms of our exercises, because we always announce them well in advance. They are subject to international observation. Observers receive briefings, they have opportunities to speak to troops, to ask questions. So we really hold the belief that building confidence and transparency is key, and we apply that vigorously to our military activities and exercises.
And so, final thing I wanted to ask about is in sort of encrypted media, because obviously many people use messaging services like WhatsApp, and indeed at the start of the coronavirus lockdown, and when we started Infotagion, that was, I think, the problem of disinformation being spread through messaging tools, particularly WhatsApp, was something that was focused on. I mean, does NATO have concerns about the role of encrypted media and therefore the difficulty that creates in trying to identify what people are talking about?
Yes, absolutely. The disinformation and misinformation in particular is widely spread through these various encrypted communications apps. Again, whether the channel itself is to be blamed for what is to be put on it is something that we still have to answer. I think it's a parallel with the platforms and others, other methods of communication, where I'm not sure that actually the encrypted messaging itself is a problem. It's what is on it and how it's spread. So in that respect, again, we at NATO feel a particular mission to tell our story straight away, so that everyone who has any questions or who gets misinformation, disinformation about NATO is able to verify it right away. But also we work, again, as I said, with all the allies, because everybody has been affected through this pandemic. We work with civil society organizations, with media, with journalists, throughout the alliance, to make sure that they are also aware and able to support us in this task of spreading information that is truthful and factual.
Absolutely. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg's talked about wanting to basically encrypt all messaging through Instagram and Facebook platforms. I mean, does that give you concern?
I don't think we have a NATO position on this. So if I say something in private, in my private capacity, again, the adversaries, the potential adversaries, can use a variety of methods, and they will do that. So will criminals. So will cyber criminals. So what is illegal and what is harmful has to be obviously fought what is the best method with it depends. If everything was encrypted, it would make much more difficult for law enforcement agencies, for democratic societies, really to fulfill their functions, probably to protect populations, be it against crime or terrorism or others. From other hand, obviously, the privacy and private space is as important. So any limitations to private space and privacy have to be in accordance with the law and necessary in democratic society. So again, that can only be done as a particular type of limitation to freedom. So the answer will be somewhere in between. So I'm sorry, I can't be more specific. It's in my private capacity, Damian,
Sure.
that I answer this question.
No, that's very helpful. I think pretty clear as well. So we'll probably have to, unfortunately, draw our conversation to a close at this point. But Baiba and Burcu, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you very much, Damian. Good to hear your voice.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Great, thank you. You've been listening to the Infotagion podcast, hosted by me, Damian Collins, featuring Baiba Braje and Burcu San. It was produced by Lucy and David Dargahi. You can find out more about Infotagion, the independent COVID-19 fact-checking service recommended by Ofcom, and send us examples of disinformation you've seen by visiting our website, infotagion.com, or using #IsolateTheLies on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Thank you until next time.